Okay, in lesson 6, we've already talked about adding integers, that a negative plus a negative is negative, and you add the two numbers together. And if you're adding a positive and a negative, you take the difference between the two numbers and it carries the sign of the bigger. Okay, we're continuing with this lesson, and this is subtracting integers. Now, in your notebook, I want you to make sure you've labeled the lesson, again, lesson 6, and then the topic here is subtracting integers. And then write down the rule, or actually write these words, rule for subtracting integers, which says that if you have two integers, a and b, and you're subtracting them, a minus b, I'm going to highlight, here's what we do. Here's actually how you subtract integers. The first integer stays the same, so a stays a. We change the minus sign to addition, but in doing so, you have to take the opposite of the next integer. Now notice there's not a symbol up here, which means that's positive. So you take the opposite of that to have it become negative. So a minus b is really the same thing as a plus a negative b. Now this isn't going to start with, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense here until we actually use some numbers, and that's what we're going to do next. But make sure you have the rule down. Now our first example, and write this down in your notebooks, right after the rule for subtracting integers, is a negative 4 minus 2. Now remember, there's a couple things that you need to keep in mind. The 4 is negative, there's a negative sign in front of it. Now, is there a sign here in front of the 2? And the answer to that should have been no, there's not. So really, remember that means it's a positive 2. So how do we subtract these? By the rule for subtracting integers, the first number stays the same. You change the minus sign to addition, but in doing so, then you have to take the opposite of the number that follows. The opposite of a positive 2 is a negative 2. Now, this has become an addition problem. And I want to reinforce that these two problems, these two equations mean exactly the same thing. We haven't changed the problem. Now, since we have an addition problem now, we use our addition rule. So a negative plus a negative is negative, and you add the two together. So what is a negative 4 minus 2? And the answer to that is a negative 6. Now let's make sure we've done this right. Let's see if it makes sense. Let's use our real world examples. If the temperature drops 4 degrees and then drops 2 more, does it make sense that it's dropped 6 degrees? And the answer to that is yes. All right, let's take a look at example 2. And actually here, before I do that, let's go back to this one. I'm going to erase part of this, and I just want to rewrite the problem. Now here is another way you can look at this. So we had a negative 4 minus 2. Now you could actually think of it this way too. You're taking away 4, and then you're taking away 2 more, right? Minus 4 minus 2. Take away 4, take away 2 more. You've taken away 6. That's another way to think of it or to check it. But you really need to get used to the subtraction rule here if you're going to have success on these in the next few weeks. All right, example 2. We have a positive 5 minus a negative 7. Now remember, there's a sign in front there, so that 7 is negative. Now, to subtract these integers, the first number stays the same. Change the subtraction symbol to addition. But then in doing so, take the opposite of the next number. What's the opposite of a negative 7? 7. So now it's just plain 5 plus 7, and we have an answer of 12 then. Example 3. Okay, the first number is a negative 10 minus, the first number is negative, and then we're subtracting the negative 3. Now let's change this to addition. So the negative 10 stays a negative 10. The subtraction sign changes to addition. But then take the opposite of the next number. Now I'm adding a positive and a negative, or a negative and a positive. So how do you add two integers where one's negative and one's positive? You take the difference between the two numbers, the difference, and ignore the signs in front of them. So the difference between 10 and 3 is 7. Now, what's larger, 10 or 3? 10 is And so our answer is going to carry the sign of the larger number. So our answer is a -7. Now let's check this part right here to see if it makes sense. If the temperature dropped 10 degrees, let's see, if it was at 0 and it dropped 10, it's a -10. Then went up by 3 degrees. Yeah, we'd be at a -7 or a negative temperature. All right, now in example 4, I want you to...
Bo Deitmeyer to the office. Bo Deitmeyer to the office.
In example 4, I want you to try these. Pause this, write it down, try them, and then let's go over them. All right, the first one, I have a -5 minus 3. So let's see, a -5 plus, remember that's a +3. Change the subtraction sign to addition. What's the opposite of that +3? -3. So really this problem means a -5 plus a -3. Negative plus negative is negative. It's a -8. Now, remember how we checked this? Another way to look at this? Taking away 5, taking away 3 more. Yep, we took away 8. Okay, the next example, a -12 minus a -4. Which is a -12 plus, what's the opposite of a -4? 4. Now how do you add a positive and a negative? Take the difference between just the numbers, ignore the signs. The difference between 12 and 4 is 8. 12 is bigger than 4. 12 is negative, so our answer is a -8. Now, let's see if that makes sense. Let's see, temperature drops 12 degrees. So it was 0, it dropped 12, we're at a -12 below. Then it goes up 4. Yep, so we're at a -8. Definitely should be a negative temperature. Now, let's go back to the original problem. -12 take away or minus 4. Now, there's another way you could look at this. Anytime you double up on signs like this, a minus, in language arts, you may have had this already, which is called a double negative. So for example, in language arts, you might have had a sentence where it says, I am not going to go to the game. Let me say that again. If you have a statement that said, I am not going to go to the game, what's that mean? It means you are going to the game. So whenever you have a minus, they actually cancel each other out. And it becomes a positive, so a -12 plus 4. And notice that's what we have down there. So that's another way to check it or to see if you did do this right. So, the topic was subtracting integers, and it's all part of lesson 6, which is adding and subtracting integers as the lesson as a whole.